The year was 1924, and Thomas Miller lived at the edge of the world. He was a telegraph operator for a newly built relay station on the rocky coast of Newfoundland. His job was simple, but very important. He sat in a small wooden building on a high cliff, looking out over the grey, cold ocean. Beneath those freezing waters lay the great transatlantic cables. These were long, thick wires wrapped in heavy rubber and steel, resting in the deep mud at the bottom of the sea. They connected the continents together. Because of these cables, a person in London could send a message to a person in New York. Thomas was the man in the middle. The messages came up from the dark water, ran through his machines, and then went along wooden poles all the way to the mainland of North America. Thomas was completely alone. The nearest town was miles away down a dirt road that was usually covered in mud or snow. A boat brought him food, coal and fresh water once a month, as long as the weather was good. Most of the time, his only company was the brass telegraph machine on his wooden desk. He did not mind the loneliness. In fact, he liked the quiet. He liked waking up in the morning, putting coal in the iron stove, and listening to the wind blow against the window. He liked making his coffee, sitting at his desk, and putting on his headphones. The clicking of the machine was like a heartbeat. He spent his days listening to the fast, sharp clicks of Morse code. He heard news about the stock market, messages from politicians, and quick notes between families. He did not care about the content of the messages, he just liked the rhythm. It made him feel safe. The world was busy and loud, but he was far away from it, hidden inside a warm room while the freezing ocean rolled on outside. The relay station was a tough building. It had thick walls made of wood and stone to stop the bitter wind. Inside it smelled of hot dust, coal smoke, and the faint, sour smell of the large wet batteries in the back room that powered the equipment. Thomas had a bed in the corner, a small kitchen area, and a large desk taking up the centre of the room. The desk was covered in wires, dials, glass tubes, and paper tape. The most important thing on the desk was the sounder. This was a brass device that made a clicking noise every time an electrical signal came through the undersea cable. When a signal arrived, an electromagnet pulled a small metal bar down with a sharp clack. When the signal stopped, a spring pulled the bar up. Clack, 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 fast and sharp. That was the sound of human beings talking to each other across the deep, dark sea. Thomas knew Morse code so well that he did not even need to think about the letters anymore. The clicks just turned into words in his head naturally, like listening to someone speak. It was late November, and the weather was changing. The days were getting very short. The sun barely rose above the grey water before it went back down again, leaving the world in a long, cold twilight. The sky was the colour of iron. Thomas knew a storm was coming. He could feel it in the air. The pressure was dropping. His joints ached a little bit. He went outside to bring in extra coal and wood. The wind was already pulling at his heavy coat. The ocean looked angry. White foam crashed against the black rocks at the bottom of the cliff. The water was not blue or green, but a dark, ugly grey. Thomas looked down at the spot where the thick black cable came out of the water and climbed up the cliff to his station. It looked like a giant black snake crawling out of the waves. He felt a sudden shiver that had nothing to do with the cold air. He went back inside, locked the heavy wooden door, and put more coal into the stove. He was ready for the storm. He felt safe in his little wooden box. The nor'easter hit just after dark. It was a violent, screaming storm. The wind howled around the corners of the building like a wild animal trying to get inside. Rain mixed with ice hit the glass windows with the sound of a handful of gravel. The whole station shook and creaked. The wooden beams groaned loudly. Thomas sat at his desk, drinking a cup of hot black coffee. He had the oil lamp turned up bright. The telegraph machine was clicking away, bringing messages from Europe. The people far away in clean offices did not know about the storm. They just kept sending their words. Thomas focused on the sharp clack of the brass sounder. It was a steady, normal sound. It was proof that the rest of the world was still there. But as the night went on, the storm grew worse. The wind screamed louder than before. The building shook harder. Thomas watched the heavy iron stove tremble on its metal legs. Then he noticed a change in the brass machine. The clicks were getting weak. They sounded muddy and slow. The rhythm was breaking apart. Sometimes there was a long pause, filled with the buzzing sound of electrical static. Thomas frowned and leaned forward. He turned the brass dials on his desk, trying to make the signal clear. He wiped the contacts with a dry cloth. He checked the wires running to the large batteries in the back room. Everything on his end was working perfectly. The problem was outside. The storm was doing something to the lines running to the mainland. The signals became softer and softer. The static grew louder, a rushing noise that sounded like the ocean itself. Thomas tapped his own brass key, trying to send a message to the mainland station to tell them he was losing the connection. There was no answer. He tried again. Still nothing. He listened closely to the sounder. The weak clicks from Europe were fading away entirely. He heard a few last broken letters, and then a long, heavy silence fell over the receiver. The regular background hum of the line was gone. The line was dead. The storm had broken the wires on the land. Thomas was entirely cut off. No one could reach him, and he could reach no one. He sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. This had happened before. It was a normal part of the job during the winter. He knew he just had to wait for the storm to pass, and then the men from the mainland would come out and fix the broken poles. There was nothing he could do until then. He tried to relax. He listened to the roaring wind and the crashing waves outside. Without the clicking of the telegraph, the room felt very empty. The silence from the machine was heavy and strange. He decided to read a book to pass the time. He opened a small novel and tried to read by the light of the oil lamp, but he could not focus on the words. His eyes kept going back to the dead brass machine on his desk. He felt a deep, uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. The isolation was suddenly very real. He was a single man in a small wooden box on the edge of a violent black ocean, completely alone. Hours passed. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. It was past midnight. The storm showed no signs of stopping. The room was getting cold, so Thomas got up to put more coal in the stove. He opened the iron door and pushed the black rocks onto the glowing red fire. As he closed the stove door, he heard a sound. It came from the desk. It was a click, but it was not the sharp, fast clack of a normal message. It was a heavy, dull sound. A loud, booming thud. Thomas froze. He looked at the desk. The telegraph machine was sitting there, dark and still. Then it happened again. Boom! The brass arm of the sounder slammed down hard against the metal base. The sound was so loud it made Thomas jump. It was not a normal electrical signal. It had too much power. It sounded as if someone had hit the machine with a heavy hammer. Boom! It happened a third time. Thomas walked slowly toward the desk. He felt a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. The line to the mainland was dead. No one could be sending a message, but the machine was moving. He sat down slowly in his wooden chair. He stared at the brass sounder. For a full minute there was nothing, just the sound of the wind outside. Then the heavy booming started again. Boom, pause, boom, pause, boom, boom, boom. Thomas watched the metal arm slam down. The force of it was incredible. The heavy wooden desk actually shook under his hands every time the arm hit the base. He put his fingers lightly on the brass key. The vibration travelled up his arm and into his chest. It felt like a deep, heavy blow. The signal was not coming from the broken mainland wires. The switchboard showed the mainland line was totally dead. The power was coming from the other direction. It was coming from the thick black cable that went down into the ocean. The signal was coming from the bottom of the sea. Thomas grabbed a pencil and a piece of clean paper. He was a trained operator. His first instinct was to write down what he was hearing. He had to record the message. He held the pencil tightly and listened to the loud booming clicks. He tried to separate them into dots and dashes. In normal Morse code, a short click is a dot and a long click is a dash. But these clicks were all the same length. They were all heavy, solid impacts. Boom, boom, boom. There were no dots or dashes. There were just pulses, separated by short pauses and long pauses. He started making marks on the paper to count the pulses. He counted 10 pulses, then a pause, then 9 pulses, then a pause, then 9 pulses, then a pause, then 9 pulses, then a long pause. He stared at the marks. What did it mean? It did not spell any words. There were no letters. He listened again. The heavy booming continued. The desk shook. His coffee cup rattled on its saucer. He counted the next group. 10 pulses, 9 pulses, 9 pulses, 8 pulses. Long pause. Thomas felt a strange tightness in his chest. His breathing became shallow. He looked at the paper. The pulses were not letters, they were numbers. The sender was using a simple counting system. 10 pulses meant the number 9, if you assumed 0 was represented by 10 pulses. He did the math in his head. The first group was 9,999. The second group was 9,998. He waited for the next group. The heavy, booming clicks slammed into the desk. 10 pulses, 9 pulses, 9 pulses, 7 pulses, 9,997. It was a countdown. Someone or something at the bottom of the ocean was counting down. Thomas dropped the pencil. His hands were shaking. This was impossible. The cable stretched across the ocean floor, resting in the deep, freezing mud 2 miles below the surface. It was total darkness down there. The pressure of the water was enough to crush a submarine like an empty tin can. There were no relay stations down there. There were no people. There was just sand, rock, blind fish, and the thick rubber cable. How could a signal be coming from the middle of the deep sea? He stood up and checked the heavy wires running from the wall to the desk. He thought maybe the storm was causing an electrical problem. Maybe lightning was hitting the water and travelling up the cable. But lightning was random and messy. Lightning caused wild, crackling static. It did not count backwards in perfect complex mathematics. He checked his batteries, he checked his dials. The machine was fine. The equipment was working exactly as it should. The signal was real. He sat back down. The booming continued. It was perfectly steady. The time between each number was exactly the same. He looked at the clock on the wall. Every group of pulses took exactly 60 seconds to finish. 1 number per minute. The slow, heavy thuds filled the small room, cutting through the noise of the screaming wind. Boom, 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 9,996. Thomas picked up his pencil again. He felt like he was in a dream. A very bad dream. He started writing the numbers down as they came. He filled one sheet of paper, then another. The numbers were getting smaller. The countdown was moving perfectly. He tried to think of a logical reason. Maybe a ship had sunk and its telegraph machine was somehow connected to the cable. No, that made no sense. A machine on a sunken ship would be ruined by the water, and dead sailors do not send a perfect countdown. Maybe it was a secret Navy test? But why here, in the middle of a terrible storm? And why use a countdown that made the desk shake with so much raw power? Then Thomas noticed something else. He had his hand resting flat on the wooden desk, near his empty coffee cup. The heavy boom sounded from the brass machine. At the exact same second he felt a vibration in the wood that did not come from the sounder. It came from the floor. He frowned and looked down at his boots. He waited for the next boom. The brass arm slammed down. At the exact same fraction of a second, the wooden floorboards under his feet trembled. It was a deep, low rumble, like a heavy train passing far away under the ground. He waited again. A minute passed. The next number started. Boom! The floor trembled again. It was slight, but it was real. The building was shaking, but not from the wind. The wind pushed against the walls. This shake came from below. It came through the stone foundation. It came from the earth itself. Thomas stood up and walked away from the desk. He stood in the middle of the room. He closed his eyes and tried to ignore the howling storm outside. He focused all his attention on the bottom of his feet. He waited. From across the room, the heavy clack of the machine rang out. At that precise moment, a deep vibration ran through the floor, through his boots, and up into his legs. It was a tremor, an earthquake. His eyes snapped open. The colour drained from his face. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. The loud clicks were not electrical signals. The undersea cable was not receiving a message from a machine. The cable was acting like a giant sensitive string. When the earth under the ocean moved, it pulled or stretched the cable. That heavy physical movement in the dark mud was sending a massive surge of raw energy up the wire, causing the brass sounder to slam down. The clicks were the sound of earthquakes. The ocean floor was shaking. Thomas walked back to the desk and leaned over the paper. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the perfect spacing, the exact timing, the flawless countdown. The earth was shaking. The solid rock of the ocean floor was shifting and cracking. But earthquakes are random. Earthquakes are nature. Nature is chaotic. Nature does not count backwards from 10,000 in perfect intervals of 1 minute, unless the earthquakes were not natural. Thomas felt a cold terror wash over him. It was a feeling of pure dread that started in his stomach and spread out to his fingers and toes. He slowly sat down in his chair. He stared at the brass machine as it boomed again. The floor shook. The earth cracked deep under the black water. He tried to wrap his mind around what was happening. He had read books about the earth. He knew the outer shell of the world was made of giant pieces of rock, huge plates that fit together like a puzzle. Sometimes they rubbed against each other, and that made earthquakes. But the shaking he was recording was different. He grabbed a fresh sheet of paper. He started drawing a line. He drew a line to represent the long black cable sitting on the bottom of the ocean. He knew exactly where the cable went. It travelled down a long, deep underwater valley. It crossed a vast flat plain of mud. Then it climbed up an enormous underwater mountain range hidden in the middle of the ocean. He marked the mountain range on the paper. He looked at his long list of numbers. He timed the shakes. He felt the power of the vibrations. The shakes were not coming from random places, they were focused. He could tell by the strength of the signal that the cracking was happening in a line. The rock was breaking in a specific direction. He drew dots along the underwater mountain range on his paper. The dots formed a shape, a straight line growing longer and wider. The heavy thuds continued on the desk. Boom, boom, boom. The floor rumbled. Thomas stared at his crude drawing. The deep earth was being broken open. The thick crust of the planet, miles of solid rock at the bottom of the sea, was being ripped apart. It was a deliberate pattern. The countdown was not a message meant to be read. It was a byproduct of an action. The rhythmic breaking of the rock was a process. Something was opening a hole in the bottom of the world. And the numbers told him exactly when the hole would be finished. The numbers told him when the door would open. He looked at the current number on his paper, 9,820. The countdown had started at 10,000. He tried to think of how long that meant. He had been listening for hours. The numbers were slowly, steadily dropping. The process was taking a long time because the rock was so thick and heavy. But it was not stopping. It was moving closer and closer to zero. Thomas put his hands over his face. He felt like his mind was falling apart. He was a simple man. He knew how to turn a wrench, how to fix a wire, how to tap a brass key. He knew the smell of coal and the sound of the ocean. He did not know how to deal with this. This was a nightmare of cosmic size. The sheer scale of it was too big to hold in his head. To break the crust of the earth in perfect sequence required a power so vast he could not even imagine it. What could do such a thing? What could strike the ocean floor with such perfect rhythm, splitting the solid rock open like an eggshell? He lowered his hands and stared out the dark window. The rain was still beating against the glass. The wind was still screaming, but the storm outside seemed tiny now. It was just a little bit of air moving around. The real storm was down there, in the pitch-black cold, 2 miles beneath the rolling waves. In his mind, Thomas saw the deep ocean. He saw the black water. He saw the thick mud. He saw the great stone plates of the earth. And then he saw the crack, a huge, jagged line of red heat tearing through the dark. He saw the rock breaking away. He saw the crack growing wider and deeper, opening up into a massive, endless canyon, leading down into the fire of the inner earth. And then he realized the worst part. Things do not break out of their own shell without a reason. A door is not opened unless something wants to walk through it. The rhythmic striking, the perfect countdown, the deliberate opening of the fissure. It was not a natural event. It was an awakening. Something was down there. Something impossibly huge, something older than the human race, older than the continents themselves. It had been sleeping down in the deep, dark places of the world. It had been buried under miles of solid stone and oceans of freezing water. But it was not sleeping any more. It was waking up, and it was slowly, patiently breaking its way out. The heavy boom of the telegraph machine slammed into the room again. The floor shook so hard this time that Thomas felt his teeth rattle. The numbers were still falling. The fissure was getting bigger. The thing in the deep was pushing harder. Thomas tried to stand up, but his legs would not work. Panic had turned his muscles to water. He wanted to run. He wanted to throw open the heavy wooden door and run out into the freezing rain and the wind. He wanted to run across the dark mud, far away from the black cable and the ocean. But where could he go? The thing that was waking up was too big. If it broke the crust of the earth, the ocean would boil. The giant waves would cover the land. Running away would do no good. There was nowhere on the planet to hide. He looked at the telegraph key. He reached his hand out, his fingers shaking badly. He wanted to warn people. He had to tell the mainland. He had to tell the government, the navy, the scientists. He touched the cold brass key and began to tap frantically. He tapped the distress signal. He tapped the code for extreme danger. He tapped a message about the earthquakes and the countdown. He pushed the key down hard, trying to force the electrical signal through the dead wires. But the line to the mainland was broken by the storm. There was no connection. His message went nowhere. It just died in the broken wires hanging from the wooden poles outside in the snow. He was shouting into an empty room. Nobody could hear him. Nobody in the bright, busy cities of America knew what was happening under the dark water. They were sleeping in their beds, safe and warm, while the bottom of their world was being ripped open. Thomas stopped tapping. He let his hand fall to his side. It was useless. He was totally alone. The only thing he could do was sit and listen. He turned his eyes back to the brass sounder. It was moving again. Boom, pause, boom, boom. The heavy thuds hit the desk. He grabbed his pencil. He had to keep track. He did not know why, but he felt he had to watch the numbers fall. It was his duty. He was the operator. His job was to receive the message, even if the message was the end of the world. He counted the pulses. The number was 9,500. The night went on. The clock ticked. The storm raged outside, and the heavy booming continued on the desk. By the time the grey light of morning began to show in the window, the station was in bad shape. The constant earthquakes had taken a toll on the building. The stone foundation was cracked. The wooden walls were leaning slightly. Fine white dust had fallen from the ceiling and covered the desk and Thomas's hair. The stove had gone out because Thomas had forgotten to put coal in it, but he did not feel the cold. He was sweating. His shirt was soaked. His eyes were wide and red, staring fixedly at the brass machine. The numbers were getting low. The strikes were getting stronger. Every time the heavy boom sounded, the entire wooden building groaned and shifted. The coffee cup had vibrated right off the edge of the desk and shattered on the floor. The books had fallen from their small shelf. The glass cover of the oil lamp was cracked. Thomas's hand was cramped and aching, covered in black graphite from the pencil. He had filled dozens of sheets of paper with the countdown. He looked at the current number. 500. 500 minutes left. A little over 8 hours. The shaking of the earth was almost constant now. It was a low, heavy rumble that never entirely stopped, punctuated by the massive, violent jerks of the main impacts. Thomas could hear the ocean outside. Even through the sound of the wind, he could hear a new noise from the water. It was a deep, boiling roar. The ocean was angry. The giant waves were crashing against the cliffs with incredible force. The water level was rising. The broken sea floor was displacing massive amounts of water, pushing it up toward the surface. He dragged his chair closer to the desk. He leaned over the paper. He counted the pulses. 499. He imagined the Titan in the deep. He pictured a shape without a definite form, a massive, shifting mountain of flesh and muscle, covered in the black mud of the abyss. He imagined giant limbs pushing against the edges of the broken stone, forcing the crack wider. He could almost hear the sound of the rock breaking, a deafening crunch miles below the water. He could feel the terrible, ancient anger of the thing. It hated the rock that trapped it. It hated the water that pressed down on it. It wanted to break free. It wanted to see the sky. 400. Thomas realized he was crying. The tears mixed with the white dust on his face, leaving dirty streaks down his cheeks. He was crying because he was terrified, but also because he felt so incredibly small. All of human history, all the cities, all the wars, all the inventions like the telegraph and the undersea cable, they meant nothing. They were just tiny scratches on the surface of a world that belonged to something else. The Titan had let them live on its back while it slept. Now it was waking up, and it was going to brush them all away. 300. The vibrations were so strong now that Thomas had to hold on to the edge of the desk to keep from falling out of his chair. The brass sounder was slamming down with a force that seemed impossible. The metal base was bending under the repeated blows. The heavy thuds echoed in Thomas's head. Boom, boom, boom. They were no longer just sounds. They were physical blows to his mind. The rhythm had taken over his heartbeat. He felt his blood pumping in time with the shifting tectonic plates. 200. The storm outside was breaking. The wind was slowing down, and the rain had turned to a light drizzle. The grey clouds were parting slightly, showing patches of pale winter sky. But Thomas did not look out the window. The changing weather meant nothing to him. The real storm was reaching its peak. The noise from the ocean was deafening now. It sounded like a continuous explosion. The ground under the station was rolling. The wooden floorboards snapped and broke. The front door of the station shook loose from its hinges and fell outward, letting the cold air and the roar of the ocean into the room. Thomas did not move. He kept his eyes locked on the brass machine. 100. Less than 2 hours left. The numbers were falling. The massive fissure at the bottom of the ocean was almost completely open. The heavy stone doors were pushed back. The Titan was pulling itself up from the boiling depths of the inner earth. Thomas could feel its presence. It was a pressure in the air, a heavy, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. It felt like standing at the bottom of the ocean, with the weight of miles of water pressing down on his chest. 50. The brass sounder began to break apart. A small screw flew off, bouncing across the dusty desk. The metal arm was warped and bent, but the massive electrical surges from the straining cable forced it to keep slamming down. Boom, boom, boom! The entire desk was jumping an inch off the floor with every strike. 20. Thomas dropped the pencil. His hand was numb. He could not write any more. He did not need to write. He knew the numbers. He was counting them out loud, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper over the roaring of the earth. 19, he whispered. The floor split down the middle. The stone foundation cracked loudly, dropping one side of the room down several inches. The heavy iron stove tipped over, spilling cold black ash onto the broken boards. 18. The thick black cable outside, the giant wire that ran down the cliff and into the sea, began to pull tight. The shifting ocean floor was dragging it down. The wooden poles outside groaned loudly as they bent toward the water. 17. Thomas gripped the edges of the desk. His knuckles were white. His eyes were completely blank, staring into the dark hole of his own terror. He was not a man anymore. He was just a witness. He was a pair of eyes and ears left behind to watch the end of the world. 16. The sounder slammed down. The brass arm snapped in half with a sharp crack. The heavy piece of metal flew across the room and hit the wall. But the broken base of the machine continued to vibrate violently with the massive energy surges. The desk shook. The earth rolled. 15. Through the open doorway, Thomas saw the ocean. The grey water was not flat anymore. It was bulging upward. A massive dome of water was rising in the distance, a mile out from the cliffs. The sea was boiling. Huge plumes of white steam shot up into the cold air. The ocean floor was completely split open. The heat of the deep earth was hitting the freezing water. 14. The dome of water grew higher. It blotted out the horizon. It was a mountain of angry, churning sea. And under the water, Thomas saw a shadow. It was moving upward. It was a shape of impossible darkness rising from the abyss. It was so big it made the huge waves look like tiny ripples. 13. Thomas could not look away. He could not run. He was paralyzed by the pure, awesome horror of the thing. His mind finally snapped. The simple telegraph operator was gone. He forgot his name. He forgot the cold. He forgot the brass machine. He was only aware of the dark shape rising in the boiling water. 12. The earth shook with a final, massive jolt. The cliff outside crumbled. Huge pieces of black rock fell into the raging water below. The thick black cable snapped tight, tearing the desk away from Thomas and pulling it across the room. The wires ripped out of the wall with a shower of sparks. 11. Thomas sat in his chair in the empty centre of the broken room. He looked out at the rising shadow. He didn't need the machine to tell him the numbers anymore. He could feel them in the deep, rhythmic thudding of the ground. The giant was pushing through the final layer of resistance. 10. The heavy beats slowed down. They were gathering strength. The final push was coming. 9. Thomas closed his eyes. He listened to the agonizingly slow, booming rhythm. He listened to the sound of the ocean tearing itself apart. He listened to the Titan coming to claim the surface of the world. 8. He sat completely still in the freezing wind, waiting for 0.